Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. We begin today with today's installment of our election series, 30 Issues in 30 Days. It's Day 12 and Issue 12. How would the New York City mayoral candidates try to improve the public schools? This is a vast topic with more moving parts than we can do justice to in one segment, right? And that affects more than 900,000 kids and their families, tens of thousands of teachers, plus other staffers, and is by far, in case you didn't know this, the biggest item in the city budget. By far, more than a third of the New York City budget every year goes to the schools. That's way more, for example, than the police and fire and sanitation departments combined. So we can't do it justice in one breath. What we will do is break it up for today into 3 education questions and come back to education again later in the series. For today, we will ask, should the mayor give up mayoral control of schools? Mamdani is proposing to actually reduce his own power over the school system if elected. Should there be more charter schools and other kinds of options? Cuomo and Sliwa are both proposing versions of that. And should gifted and talented programs be expanded, contracted, or remain the same from kindergarten all the way up through the specialized high schools, Bronx Science, Stuyvesant, the others? Candidates disagree on that. Our guide for this is Alex Zimmerman, reporter for the education news site Chalkbeat New York. Alex, thanks for joining our 30 Issues in 30 Days segment. Welcome back to WNYC.
It's good to be here.
And listeners, with a stake in this, we will invite your calls on each of these 3 questions as we go. Mayoral control of schools first. Who thinks the mayor should have or give up the basically unilateral power to appoint the chancellor and sign off on all education policy decisions? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Parent or teacher, anybody else, pro or con, call or text, or if you just have a question to ask Alex about this, that of course is welcome too. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Alex, give us a little background on this first. Mayoral control of schools came in with Mayor Bloomberg in 2002, approved by the state, which has authority over that. After years of a more decentralized system, why did power over the city schools consolidate at that time?
Yeah, so there had been an argument that the previous system of school governance, which basically delegated authority to these 32 local school boards, was just sort of too fragmented and too kind of rife with patronage and corruption. And that by centralizing power, you could really enact a vision for what is an enormous system, an enormous bureaucracy, because you would have one person ultimately responsible for it and in control of it. And many listeners will recall that Bloomberg really ran on a very sweeping education agenda. Like, he had a lot of ideas about how the school system should change. And I think he felt like in order to execute that, he needed to have control of it. Like, he couldn't have all these different decision makers and veto points potentially gumming up the works. And so he pushed really hard for the state legislature to give him control over the school system's budget, the power to appoint a chancellor, and, like you said, sort of policy control.
And listeners, this can be one way that you have input on this. Those of you who've lived through this as a teacher, a student, a parent, anyone else, did the Bloomberg reforms, which were very controversial at the time, some of you will remember, mostly worked, mostly didn't work. De Blasio reforms were different, undid some of Bloomberg, tried some things of his own, or things that Mayor Adams has done as in charge solely of the public schools. We can, talk about anything in that arc, but landing ultimately on the question, who should control schools now? 212-433 WNYC. And the Mamdani for Mayor website says he, quote, supports an end to mayoral control and envisions a system instead in which parents, students, educators, and administrators work together to create the school environments in which students and families will best thrive, strengthening co-governance through the PEP, SLTs, DLTs, and CECs in particular, unquote. So, Alex, without translating each of those acronyms, can you explain what kind of shared decision-making Mamdani is proposing there, and with the hopes of improving what on behalf of the students?
Yeah, these are really, really key questions about what he's proposing. And unfortunately, he hasn't really spelled out a lot of details about what he has in mind. The groups you just mentioned are there's a sort of advisory board called the Panel for Educational Policy that, votes on lots of contracts, though it is majority appointed by the mayor. So we've seen over the years some efforts to tinker with the membership of the PEP by, adding members, adding parent representatives. Mamdani seems to be hinting that he would be open to more tweaks to that board. Some of the other kind of alphabet soup groups you mentioned are really, some of them are sort of school level groups that help kind of manage sort of local decisions, kind of in consultation with the principal and others. And so you could imagine that what Mamdani is gesturing at there is some sort of system that consults those groups more intentionally in crafting citywide policy. I think the big question that kind of hangs over this proposal is, does he imagine lobbying state lawmakers in Albany to really fundamentally change the structure of mayoral control, or is he sort of more leaning toward, I want more parent input in my policymaking, but the decision is still ultimately going to rest with me?
Both the Cuomo and Sliwa sites say explicitly they would keep mayoral control of schools. What are some of their critiques of Mamdani's idea to end it, or arguments against?
Yeah, I think, one of the main themes we've heard, not just from Sliwa and Cuomo, but from basically every mayor who has had mayoral control since Bloomberg, is that the advantage is it's really obvious who is making policy, right? It's the mayor. And if you disagree with what the mayor is doing on education policy, then there's a really clear person to hold accountable. Now, and you also hear from lots of people that there are sort of big picture policy items that would be really hard to do if you didn't have mayoral control. And a lot of people point to universal pre-K, which was implemented by Mayor Bill de Blasio, as something that would have been really hard if you didn't have like a lot of control over the bureaucracy to stand up all of these new classrooms and coordinate with all of these community organizations that ended up providing a large percentage of the seats. And so I think if when you hear from Cuomo and Sliwa, they have agendas and they want to be in charge of executing them.
Let's take a phone call. Here's Gail in Sunnyside, who says she's a retired teacher. Gail, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you for taking my what I want to say. I taught under de Blasio, and I remember Cuomo treating him. Cuomo was like a Donald, the president. He doesn't really care about schools. He kept pushing the charter schools, and he held money back that belonged to the city. As he was running for the last time, he said, "Oh, look, I found money," and I could keep on talking. So
that's kind of a global critique of Cuomo with respect to this issue and his record as governor. But the question on the table right now, and I see you did talk to our screener about this, is should the city continue with mayoral control of public schools, or as Mamdani is proposing, should power be disaggregated? You have a thought about that?
Yes, and I would go with Mamdani. Yes,
because
being that I've taught. Because the other doesn't work. Things that was slashed from like special ed. I'm really angry, so the words are not coming out. There needs to be more of an input, particularly with the parents. Absolutely. So I am voting for Mondami.
If you're retired now, then you were probably around, correct me if I'm wrong, to some degree pre-mayoral control of schools. Were there things
Correct.
in that system that you thought worked better, ultimately
Yes.
in the interests of the students? Can you be specific at all about those?
Yes, I can. I was a special ed teacher for a while, and the money that should have been there, excuse me, was being cut. Like, if you have a special ed school, the children go there, they have whatever it is that they need. I saw Bloomberg just cut it. And schools that were working, he just cut. And the children and their parents, they hurt. It was horrible. Like I said, I'm pretty angry, so the words are not coming out as I would like. It was ugly, absolutely ugly working with him.
Gail, thank you for your memories and your input. Alex Zimmerman, reporter for the education news site Chalkbeat. You think a lot of teachers who were there in those days had a similar take on Bloomberg, and do you think the most specific charge maybe that she made there, that he cut money for special ed, is factually accurate?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I should put my cards on the table in that I was not, I did not cover the Bloomberg administration. That was before my time as an education reporter, so I'm not sure exactly which kind of funding fight that was referring to. But I will say, like, Bloomberg was, quite known for doing battle with the teachers union and making lots of kind of structural changes, kind of unilaterally. And I think that did rub a lot of teachers the wrong way. I think he sincerely felt like there were good reasons to make some structural changes to the system. He was, in favor of expanding charter schools, which happened pretty rapidly on his watch. And that's something also that the teachers union was resistant to. So there were a lot of big fights about how the system should be structured and what kinds of schools should proliferate. And I think there were people who had real criticisms of that. There were a lot of school closures under Bloomberg's watch. He broke up a lot of big high schools and created new small schools, which many of which still exist today. There was just a moment of lots of educational change in the city in general, and I think people had really strong feelings about that.
Here's another critique of Bloomberg that came in a text, kind of builds on what the caller Gail was saying. Listener writes, I believe Bloomberg wanted control in order to bust the teachers union and create all those charter schools that began siphoning money out of public education. We should say charters, which are going to be our next topic explicitly, are public schools, but there are differences, including that they're not unionized. And this says he wanted to bust the union and create all those charter schools that began siphoning money out of public education and unionize teaching jobs. It continues, he was a businessman and he did not like to have to deal with unions, so weakening them was a big part of his agenda. Again, I don't know if you can just say true or false if you weren't a reporter at that time on education, but I think a lot of teachers believe that.
Yeah, and I think that is not without merit as an argument. I think, Bloomberg again felt like there were reforms that were really needed to improve the system that the union was resistant to. Again, I think different people will have different takes on the validity of that. And obviously, the vast majority of New York City teachers are in traditional public schools, not charter schools. And to the extent that those ideas were kind of rankling the union and rank and file teachers, that pushback makes sense. I think a more contemporary issue that I often hear about in the context of Mayor Eric Adams is, he really exerted mayoral control when he required that all elementary schools use a standard set of city-approved reading curriculums. And I often hear from teachers that it was really unclear to them, how that decision was made, how the city decided which 3 curriculums they were going to mandate. And, I think you see a strain of this in Mamdani's arguments about mayoral control, that like there just shouldn't be big policy moves that blindside teachers in schools and where they feel uncertain about like where these new curriculums are coming from. And I think that that's the kind of thing that like Mamdani is reacting to when he's sort of proposing a system that, as he puts it, is sort of more framed around co-governance.
Yeah. Some texts are coming in on the other side of the call we took. Listener writes, I will support Mamdani, but parents cannot be the ones controlling or co-controlling city schools. There's already cyclical uncertainty in schools when a new mayor comes to power, whole new curricula, expectations, etc. The best thing to me as a public school parent is to have a centralized structure with each school having some agency in decision making. We want to avoid trying to practice utopia with our city schools. They are a giant bureaucracy, 1 million kids, and do need a steady hand at the wheel. That from one public school parent. Another one writes, of course we need educators to provide the education, and we need professional administrators to run the business of the department. We keep switching because each side messes up the other side, I guess meaning mayoral control or non-mayoral control or business and education messing each other up. I don't have a solution, writes this very honest listener. Bob in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Bob.
Hey, Brian. My call. I was a public school teacher during the Bloomberg administration, before the Bloomberg administration, and of the de Blasio administration. And I could talk for a long time about Michael Bloomberg. Whether or not he thought he was doing the right thing isn't, for me, the point. The point for me is that there were no checks and balances. You are at the whim of one person. Whether they're, and some people will agree with that person and some won't. But even if a lot don't agree with them, as in the case of billionaire Mike Bloomberg, nothing changes. It stays that way for 3 terms. 12 years. So I think that the old system was correctly rife with corruption, as was the new system. The way that they ordered books and supplies, centralizing it was very difficult. So my idea would be to try to set up something a little bit more streamlined that involved more than one person. I think that is more of what's in order, and I completely agree with the text about not making it part of the parental decisions.
Bob, thank you very much for your input. We're going to do one more here before we switch to our other 2 education mayoral campaign issues, at least for today. There are so many, as I said in the intro to the segment, there are so many education issues. We're going to do a few today, and we're going to come back to education later in the series. We're going to go on to charter schools explicitly soon, and gifted and talented programs, recent Mamdani proposal to undo those, at least for kindergarten, and we'll take that conversation all the way up through the Bronx Science, Stuyvesant specialized high school test and all of that. Those are coming up. But one more now on the explicit question of mayoral control, which Mamdani says he would end. Sliwa and Cuomo say they would keep. Brock on the Lower East Side, you're on WNYC. Hello, Brock.
Oh, hi, Brian. Love your show, and I've called in a few times before. So I'm 66, but I've got 2 teenagers in the system, and have been a part of the whole education thing. And mayoral control was by far the best thing. One of the things people are not talking about is that Bloomberg doubled the teacher's salary and the performance. Instead, he got pushback. And yeah, he did an end game around the union, all right. Low-performing schools, he closed and opened another school in its place. You cannot fire a teacher in the New York City system. So you had the rubber room. As a result, you could close the school.
The rubber room, for people who don't know that, reference, forgive me for jumping in, is basically a place where, at least at one time, I don't know if they still have it, maybe Alex, you'll tell us, teachers who were considered to not be doing a good job but were not fireable were sent to kind of spend their days, the so-called rubber room. But Brock, go ahead.
So that's one thing. But the other thing I want to talk about was parental influence and control. Bloomberg established something called the SLT by removing PTA parents as presidents and stuff like that. And you do have input. It's an elected position by other parents. I was on the SLT,
School leadership
110.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you. And so there is input. But if you want to see what parental control looks like, go take a look at schools in Long Island, rife with corruption, the presidents hiring their friends for the school lunch program and things like this. No way. Again.
Brock,
that's basically my feeling.
Thank you very much. So there's a supporter of what Bloomberg did who liked closing schools that were deemed as failing, basically based on test scores, I think is fair to say, and opening new schools in their place and trying to have accountability, really, for the performance of schools. It's also related at that time, Alex, as you know, to what was going on at the federal level, right? The first year of the George W. Bush presidency, there was that big national education bipartisan bill that he negotiated with Ted Kennedy, known as No Child Left Behind. That was very much what Bloomberg was trying to implement at the local level. And there was a lot of pushback on that over the years, because of too much reliance on standardized tests to evaluate both teachers and students. But there are those like Brock who think that was effective. Are there metrics that you can look back on, even if you didn't report in the Bloomberg days, and say, yeah, he really did increase the number of kids reading at grade level and doing math at grade level, or any other way they were trying to measure that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can point to kind of some of the overall metrics of the school system's health, like graduation rates and test scores, and see increases over the time that we've had mayoral control. Now, does that mean that mayoral control is the sort of causal factor there? Like, I think that's a harder case to make. I think like one thing that's tricky about this debate is there just isn't a clear answer from like a student performance perspective about like, is one method of governance just obviously better than the other? They both obviously have some trade-offs. I mean, we see in school districts that have school board elections. There are often sort of critiques of that model. In New York City, we have elections on these local parent councils that are often kind of quite low turnout. And, there have been critiques of the education department for not doing more to promote turnout in those races. And they're not very high salience. Like, these local school boards don't have a lot of power right now. So that might explain some of the low turnout. But I think there would also be concerns about who would have influence if we move to an elected school board. And, we're seeing some experiments with that now across the country. Like, Chicago is in the process of transitioning from mayoral control to an elected school board. So we will have at least one case study kind of in the works about how that shakes out and how parents feel about it. One last point I just wanted to make is, Mamdani has a really interesting test of this coming up. Mayoral control is authorized by the state legislature, and it expires in the middle of next year. So Mamdani is going to have to decide pretty quickly after taking office if he wins. Any of the candidates would, if they win, will have to decide in January, like, how they want to approach the state legislature. Like, would Mamdani actually go to Albany and say, like, strip me of mayoral control, and here's the system I want you to kind of come in with? Or would he advocate for a renewal for now while he kind of figures out what he wants the governance model to look like? Like, I think these are really important questions that he's going to have to answer pretty quickly.
And one more text, since just about everybody has trashed no matter which side of the question they're on, has trashed the corruption of the old pre-Bloomberg local school districts, at least some of them, enough for it to be a reason for reform. Listener writes, the talking points about corrupt local school boards are well worn because they were used to shut down local control, but they eclipse the majority of work done by local school boards, good faith efforts to make positive changes in neighborhood schools, writes that one listener. All right, it's our 30 Issues in 30 Days election series, day 12, issue 12. How Mamdani, Cuomo, and Sliwa would try to improve the New York City public schools. We're taking on 3 questions within that vast topic. Up next, should there be more charter schools and other kinds of options? Cuomo and Sliwa are both proposing versions of that, with Alex Zimmerman from the Education News website Chalkbeat, and your calls and texts on that now. No more calls and texts on mayoral control of schools as we move on to charters and other kinds of options. With your experiences, comments, and questions, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, right after this. Brian Lehrer on WNYC in our 30 Issues in 30 Days election series, day 12, issue 12, how Mamdani, Cuomo, and Sliwa would try to improve the public schools. Our next question within that today, should there be more charter schools and other kinds of options? Cuomo and Sliwa are both proposing versions of that. And again, our guest is Alex Zimmerman from the Education News website Chalkbeat, and our phones and texts are open, 212-433 WNYC. Alex, the Mamdani website education page does not mention charter schools one way or another. The Sliwa site says end the charter schools cap and expand high-performing charters, especially in underserved neighborhoods. The Cuomo site says support diverse, high-impact school models, diverse school models, which I'm guessing is an oblique reference to charter schools. I don't think one of his 25 points that are on a site for improving the public schools says charters specifically, but I'm reading that as meaning charters. But I wonder if you would remind everybody first, what are charter schools? They are public schools. So what makes them different from regular public schools or what they call district schools?
Yeah, so charter schools are public in the sense that they're publicly funded, but they are privately managed. So they're, managed separate from the sort of traditional district school bureaucracy. They're not sort of supervised by the education department. They're sort of private organizations that have their own sort of boards of directors, and they are also typically not unionized and are therefore free from a lot of the rules in the teachers union contract. So they often have, longer school years or longer school days. And kind of the original promise of charter schools was that they would kind of be this model that would allow for a lot of experimentation in different types of school model. And in sort of the broader education policy context, charter schools are also sort of seen as a compromise between something more along the lines of like private school vouchers, so public money to send kids to private schools. This was a way of kind of creating a kind of private organization managing a public school that wasn't, fully a voucher, but would still kind of have this public funding component to it. And yeah, they've really proliferated in New York City over the past, more than 20 years. There are now about 150,000 kids enrolled in charter schools. That's about 15% of all public school students. So, not a majority of the schools, but have grown in recent years.
Why do organizations start charter schools? If they're not businesses, they're part of the public system. They presumably, tell me if this is too generous, are not in it for the profit of the founders. So what's the range of organizations that have started charter schools, and for what purposes?
Yeah, there's a real range. There are a number of what are often referred to as mom and pop charters, which are smaller organizations that are often connected to the communities that they're operating in. and, might have themes, might have, a specific focus or a specific focus on STEM, like science and technology, or might, have just like an experimental model. We've seen some attempts in charter schools to, try personalized learning and other kind of models like that. And then you have other charters that are operated by these larger networks. So the most prominent in New York City is Success Academy, but you also have KIPP and Achievement First and Uncommon schools operating in New York. And these are, kind of efforts to scale kind of a brand of charter schools that might have, where like if you go to one Success Academy elementary school in Harlem, that's going to look a lot like a Success Academy a Success Academy school in the Bronx, right? Like they're operating on the same curriculum and the same model, and it's an effort to kind of take one, they would argue sort of successful model and scale that across the city. So you kind of have both these sort of like one-off charters that are all different in various ways, and then these sort of larger networks that are trying to scale kind of like one model in a broader way.
Do CEOs, let's say, of some of the big charter school networks, Eva Moskowitz is always in the news as, big advocate of charters. She runs Success Academy. I'm not trying to single her out, but, she's become sort of a symbol of this. What do the CEOs of these bigger charter school networks get out of it? Are they getting wealthy? Can we see these as business investments for some of the people, or is that too critical? Because they are nonprofits, and presumably people who start and organizations that start charter schools do it out of a nonprofit mission as they see it.
Right. Yeah, that is an important feature of New York's charter landscape, which is that in virtually all cases, the schools are run as nonprofits. There are some other states that operate for-profit charters. That's a little bit of a different model. I think people like Eva Moskowitz, who's the CEO of Success Academy, are really trying to scale up schools that they think can outperform the city's traditional public schools and get results for kids that in many cases are, at least if you measure by test scores, like higher than traditional district schools. That's not true across the entire charter sector. There's actually some variability between schools. But if you ask people like Eva Moskowitz, like why they're doing this, I think they would tell you that like parents deserve to have a large variety of school choices. And we think we can offer a model that is both different from the traditional public school system and can get better results for a student body that is, predominantly families of color, and families who in many neighborhoods haven't had, have said that they don't feel like their traditional public schools are quality options.
So what's the argument against choice?
I think in the current context, the debate is often about enrollment, right? Like the traditional public school system is losing students. Enrollment is going down. And if you have a proliferation of charters at the same time, you have, sort of these two competing systems all trying to enroll a shrinking number of students. And so I think there's a question right now about like how sustainable is it to keep increasing the number of charter schools? And, sort of absent the enrollment conversation, like part of the debate is, do these schools kind of come at the expense of traditional public schools, right? Like schools get funding based on the number of students they enroll. So there is kind of, in some sense, a zero-sum quality to it, right? Like if a charter school opens near a traditional public school and some of those students leave, or, that school's enrollment suffers, that also means fewer dollars for that school. And so I think, in New York City, we've seen a lot of kind of tension around that.
And is it fair to say, here's a text, for example, but I'm going to ask you to fact check the premise here. Text says, what are the supposed benefits of charter schools besides being that teachers don't belong to a union and they can choose their students? Do they choose their students, or in what way? Because this is not the way you get into a charter school. It's not like the next conversation that we're going to have, which is about screening for gifted and talented programs, right?
Right. Yeah. So charters, generally don't screen in the sense of like looking at a student's academic record and deciding like, oh, you're not a strong enough student to be at this school. In sort of structure, anyone can apply to a charter school. And then if there are more applications than there are actual seats, then there's a lottery. Now, I do want to complicate that a little bit in the sense that we have seen some charter networks like Success Academy be pretty unapologetic about their model and have, in some cases explicitly said to parents, like, here's what our school is like. It has a really strict kind of discipline framework. We also expect a lot of parent involvement at home in addition to what your child is getting at school. And if you don't feel that that is right for your family, then you should go elsewhere.
They kick kids out more, which the public schools can't, except in the rarest instances. And that's a way in which they actually do select their students. Or is that overstated?
I mean, I think there have been some documented cases, right, of charter schools suspending a student many times and a parent interpreting that as, getting counseled out. Pretty famously, there was a charter school in the Success Academy network that was maintaining a gotta go list, which at the time the network basically said was like an anomaly, that wasn't a practice that was like being used across the network. But I think it has kind of led to this impression that people have that there are charter schools that are, aggressive in terms of like what students there feel like they're set up to serve. I would say the other thing that, gives people the impression that charter schools are selective is that, in order to go to a charter school, you have to participate in a separate application, right? Like when you apply to a traditional public school, you're typically ranking a set of options on an education department application. And so if you want to go to a charter school, you have to navigate this separate system of schools and apply to them. And, some people point out that in itself is a self-selecting thing. You might get families who are, have more access to information or resources who are choosing those schools.
Mike in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Mike.
Hi. Okay, there's so much misinformation out there. There are pros and cons of charters, and there's pros and cons of regular district schools.
And let me just say that you told our screener that you have worked in both charter and regular public schools. Is that correct?
Yes, I was a high school teacher in public schools. I was a principal of an elementary school in the regular public school district, and I worked in 2 different charter schools. But people start talking about selection. People start talking about selection in charter schools. For the most part, they're just done by lottery. And yes, there's some self-selection and there's some, telling parents this is what you're signing up for. So really be careful about your choice. And people can say that's selecting out. I saw what went on in District 2 and District 3 in Manhattan. The way they selected kids in regular public schools, I'm not talking about charters now, regular public schools for middle school was criminal. Kids had to apply from elementary school to middle school, and the middle school administrators were able to I saw this with my own eyes. They hand-selected the students they wanted, and that's why you would have these really high-performing middle schools in District 2 and District 3. The students' folders who they didn't want to accept.
That's basically lower Manhattan and the West Side, right?
Right. East Side, West Side of Manhattan, this was going on like this was just a normal standard operating procedure. If you were a principal of a middle school, you would get files of 5th graders that you would select for your 6th grade. They would handpick the kids they wanted, and then the kids they didn't want, they would send to the next group of middle schools. And then those schools would hand select the kids they wanted, and by the time you got to that 3rd round, you would have middle schools that were full of kids that none of the other higher performing middle schools wanted. I saw this firsthand.
So, in your opinion, is the proliferation of charter schools a good corrective to that?
Okay, so nothing's perfect, but here's the basic idea. And Brian, you asked the question before of like, why would someone open a charter school? People I met basically said, in some districts, there were some abysmally failing public elementary schools. If you were a parent that lived in that zone, that was your only choice, was to send your kid to a school that was doing a terrible job. Okay? And there were some schools that had huge challenges. And I don't blame the teachers. I don't blame the administrators. It's a larger social problem, right? But there are certain districts and certain schools that were really struggling. And if you were a parent and that's where you lived, that's where you had to send your kid. You had no choice. Somebody, a charter person, and I've met these people, they come in and they basically say, I can run a better school than that. So give me a chance, give me this charter to open a school and let me try and do a better job. And now if that parent wants to come to my school, that parent can come to my school and say, I worked in those buildings. I've talked to so many people who criticize charter schools, and then I say to them, have you ever stepped foot in a charter school? And they'll admit to me, they've never actually spent time in a charter school.
And Mike, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for putting all of that on the table. One more call on this before we go to Chapter 3 of this 30 Issues in 30 Days segment on how Mamdani, Sliwa, and Cuomo say they would improve the public schools, and that'll be on the Gifted and Talented programs per se. Bill in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Bill.
Yep, hello. My question is there any program in New York City to incentivize teachers by remunerating them for their college expenses? Like, in other words, do we have any kind of incentives for flooding the zone with teachers and other school resources?
Bill, thank you. Do you understand his question there, Alex? I think the premise is there's a shortage of teachers and we don't have enough to go around for all the charter schools and the district schools. But is that a real problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially in the context of the class size law that is being phased in on the district schools, which are going to have to hire thousands of new teachers to staff these smaller class sizes, like teacher recruitment is a really big issue right now. It's interesting. I've started talking to some charter leaders about like whether they're worried about finding teachers in the context of all of this hiring that has to happen. And it seems like it hasn't quite hit the charter sector yet, at least in terms of that class size law and how it could affect them just in terms of the broader labor market. But yeah.
So let me jump in on that, because despite what we've been discussing as one of the biggest differences between charters and other public schools, which is that most of the union rules don't apply in the charters, do teachers, is it possible to say as an education reporter, do teachers generally find it a worse experience for them to be employed there?
You know, I think it's hard to characterize like across all charters. Like, I think part of the point of the sector is that these schools are all different. And so I think similar to district schools, you have teachers who have a pretty wide range of experiences at these different schools.
Is the pay the same?
That's a good question. I haven't seen like a really careful analysis of that lately. So I'm a little reluctant to say definitively, but there are benefits in the traditional school system that charter schools don't have. So for example, right, like there's a really strong pension system in DOE schools that charter school teachers don't get now.
Oh, you're not in the pension system, huh?
Sorry?
The teachers in the charter schools are not in the pension system, you're saying. That's big. Right.
And, I think some charter schools do have higher base salaries to try to, compensate for that a little bit. But yeah, the compensation structures are not identical.
So to bring it back to the mayoral race, I mentioned at the beginning of this section that the Mamdani website education page does not mention charter schools one way or another. The Sliwa site says end the charter schools cap and expand high-performing charters. The Cuomo site says support diverse, high-impact school models, which I take to be a euphemism for charters. Tell me if I'm wrong. But is there really an active debate here? Is Mamdani lining up with the union or, some of the others who may see themselves as in a quote, progressive camp in opposing the expanded charter school caps? As I say, it's not on his education page on the website. So is Mamdani out there fighting charter schools, or is it really even an issue in the campaign?
So yes, the answer is Mamdani has staked out a fairly anti-charter position in the sense that he has publicly said that he thinks that charters divert resources away from traditional public schools, and that he thinks they shouldn't be granted space in city buildings. About 43% of charters are co-located in education department buildings. And he's also said that he would launch audits of charter schools if he's elected. So he has really kind of staked out a more critical posture toward the charter sector. Now, his power over the charter schools is somewhat limited. I mean, there are these space sharing arrangements, but there's a state law that actually former Governor Andrew Cuomo helped pass that requires the city to either find space in public buildings or else subsidize their rent in private space. I think, people are worried that Mamdani would, be an opponent in Albany, which has a lot of power over, whether new charter schools can open. Like maybe he'll lobby the state legislature to keep the current cap in place. Right now, new charter schools can't open. So I do think there is a debate here, but I think the mayor's power to directly, fundamentally alter the charter landscape is also somewhat limited.
But you're also saying Cuomo, as governor, was an advocate for expanding the reach of charter schools. So there's a contrast there.
Yeah, and I should also say that Cuomo recently unveiled a plan to close the city's lowest performing schools and replace them with other models, including charter schools. So he has, I think, since the primary, been more vocal in his sort of pro-charter stances.
More like the Bloomberg model we were talking about before, closing low-performing schools rather than sort of trying to improve them in place, which is, I think, what the de Blasio approach was.
Right, yeah, and it's been interesting. In the primary, Cuomo was talking more about community schools and hiring more paraprofessionals, which are, union-supported ideas. And since the primary and his loss and the teachers union endorsement of Mamdani, he has come out and been more of a critic of the teachers union and some of their priorities. He's been more critical of the class size mandate, for instance, and he's been more vocally supportive of charter schools. It's been a kind of interesting turn for him.
Oh, Cuomo is critical of the class size mandate, and for those of you who don't know, that's a recent state law requiring smaller class sizes, because the Cuomo website has a line. Let's see if I can pull it up real quick. I think I can't pull it up quick enough. But I think in the 25 points on education that his website lists, one of them is fully implement the class size law. Yeah,
it's interesting. I think there has been a change in rhetoric on his part on this. And I was listening to a town hall he did last week with a group called Place, which is also quite critical of the class size law. And he described it as a reckless law. And I think he was basically making the point that in order to implement it, you need a lot of money, and the state hasn't promised to fully fund it. So he was basically like, we can't implement this without an influx of money, and that he kind of disagreed with that kind of mandate.
From his site, here we go. Reduce class size, secure state funding to implement the reduced class size law so it is not an unfunded mandate. Ensure the reduced class size law does not reduce the capacity of selective schools. And that's a good segue to part 3, which is going to be about selective schools right after this.
In the play Art, the relationship between 3 old friends gets heated after one of them drops 6 figures on an all-white painting. Actor Bobby Cannavale stars, and on the next Olivet, he joins us to discuss, along with director Scott Ellis. Plus, singer-songwriter Yasmin Lacey joins us for a listening party. I'm Allison Stewart. Join us for all of it, weekdays at noon on WNYC.
WNYC receives support from Perlman Performing Arts Center, presenting PAC NYC Icons of Culture, featuring conversations with women who are shaping today's cultural landscape, October 29th to November 1st. Tickets at pacnyc.org. Cowan, Leibowitz & Latman, an intellectual property law firm helping businesses protect their domestic and international trademarks, copyrights, and patents. More at cll.com. Experience Montclair. The 14th annual Montclair Film Festival takes place October 17th through the 26th. Over 130 screenings and events, including a tribute to Spike Lee, hosted by Stephen Colbert. Tickets at montclairfilm.org.
The New York Phil. Diego Matthews conducts music by Inocente Carreño, and concertmaster Frank Huang performs Korngold's Violin Concerto. October 23rd through 25th at David Geffen Hall. Tickets at nyphil.org.
And listeners, a reminder that you can sign up for free if you're interested for the Brian Lehrer Show newsletter. It includes a weekly column from me, often about the mayoral race these days, a reader question for you to answer if you choose, and some other features. To sign up, just go to wnyc.org/BL newsletter, wnyc.org/BL newsletter. It'll come to your inbox every Thursday afternoon. Brian Lehrer on WNYC in our 30 Issues in 30 Days election series. And listeners, I hope this has been useful for you so far. We're on day 12, issue 12, about public education as an issue in the New York City mayoral race. We're going back and forth between mayoral race issues and New Jersey gubernatorial race issues, and trying to do something that we think makes public radio unique, which is to focus so much on the issues and less on the politics and the polls and the personalities, though we do that too. Politics matters when you're talking about politics, right? But our main focus is the issues. We've done 30 Issues in 30 Days series for many elections, for many years, and we're doing it again this year. And we just hope it's a useful service, just saying that out loud. So yeah, day 12, issue 12, how Mamdani, Cuomo, and Sliwa would try to improve the public schools. We're taking on 3 questions within that vast topic, and we will come back to education for at least one more that we have planned later in the series. But finally, for today, should gifted and talented programs be expanded, contracted, or remain the same from kindergarten all the way up through the specialized high schools? Now, candidates do disagree on this. Mamdani just recently proposed ending gifted and talented kindergarten programs. So we'll talk about that and more as we continue with Alex Zimmerman from the education news website Chalkbeat, and your calls and text with your experiences, your comments, or your questions. And thank you for those of you so far who have called in with most of your experiences as teachers and some as parents. 212-433 WNYC, call or text 212-433-9692 on gifted and talented and specialized high schools. Alex, what's the Mamdani kindergarten proposal?
Yeah, so Mamdani has said that he wants to phase out the kindergarten entry point for gifted and talented programs. Gifted and talented programs have been a lightning rod in education politics for many years. These are classrooms that are often separate. They can be in sort of traditional public schools, but in a separate classroom. And there are a handful of citywide GNT programs that are schools that only serve students who have been labeled as gifted. And so Mamdani's proposal is to end the kindergarten pathway into those programs, basically arguing that it is inappropriate to try to sort 4-year-olds by their sort of ability, either on the basis of a test or, right now the process works through teacher nominations.
This relates to 2 larger questions that maybe we should put this in the context of. Tracking by ability in general, and which kids that's good for and bad for, and also integration versus segregation in the public schools, which remain very segregated. How much do you think the G&T debate is mostly the leading edge of those larger topics?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. New York City has an unusual amount of screening, not just in gifted programs, but also in middle and high schools, where schools and programs can admit students based on their prior academic record. And there's a lot of debate about whether that is something that public schools should do. Like, should these programs really be open to all students? Or is it appropriate to say that there are students who can handle a more accelerated curriculum, or who are ahead of their peers and need some kind of specialized instruction? This has been a debate that's been pretty hot in the past. Mayor Bill de Blasio proposed phasing out gifted programs in his last months in office. So he wasn't around to execute on that. And Mayor Eric Adams basically disagreed and said, no, I want to expand gifted programs in neighborhoods that have historically lacked access to them. And crucially, Adams also proposed adding more gifted programs that begin in third grade. And the idea behind that is, like, once you've had a couple years of schooling, then it's easier to kind of figure out which students might really benefit from more accelerated learning, and you're not just sort of picking up on differences in students' home lives that they're bringing when they're just starting in school.
Right, which raises the question, what does gifted or talented even mean, right? It suggests that you're born with some innate ability that should lead to the privilege of being separated from other school kids so that you can really lean into those gifts that you were born with. Otherwise, we are talking about what children's actual early childhood before school experience is based on, what kind of resources their parents had, what kind of attention to giving them reading and math instruction when they were 2 years old was being done in the home, English language skills, things like that, right?
Yeah, and I mean, one critique you often hear of the gifted programs is that they're generally not using curriculums that are very different from what regular classrooms are using. And you also see that these programs are not at all representative of the broader school system. So, Black and Latino students are 62% of the school system, but less than 25% of the students enrolled in G&T programs. About 70% of G&T students are white or Asian, compared to about 35% of the total student body. So there's a lot of argument that these classes are mostly about keeping more middle class or more affluent families in the system. There's also a non-trivial number of Asian American families and even Black and Latino families who see these as ways of getting into more selective middle schools and sort of being a launch pad for the rest of your educational career. So it's a kind of complicated debate. And it's interesting that Mamdani has decided to stake out a position on it so close to the election.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM New York, WNJT FM, 88.1 Trenton, WNJP, 88.5 Sussex, WNJY, 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO, 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio and live streaming at WNYC.org at a minute before 11 o'clock as we continue in 30 Issues in 30 Days, education as an issue in the mayoral race. And Catherine in Queens, you're on WNYC. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Brian, longtime listener. Hi, Alex, longtime reader, recovering teacher over here, calling in to talk about GNT. And I've heard words like segregated and integrated used. I'm sure you're both familiar with the word inclusion and also the model of inclusion classroom teaching, which we use for a diversity of needs in our classrooms. And I think that we ought to think about that more when we're talking about gifted and talented students, because overall it is just a differentiated need that a student has. I, in particular, want to point out about not including 4 and 5-year-olds into a general classroom with diverse kids is something that we don't do in our general population. We don't sort of segregate people out by their specialties of knowledge, right, on a bus or in our restaurants, right?
So just to say, to bring our listeners along, that you're specifically endorsing the Mamdani proposal in that respect, because that is his specific proposal: no G&T separation for 4 and 5-year-olds in kindergarten, right?
Yeah, and I'd like to take it a step further and say that kindergarten is not a mandatory grade in the United States of America, as it is in Scandinavian countries and many other countries across the globe. Kindergarten is a developmentary grade where we're introducing many students, especially this kindergarten classroom, which is considered the pandemic K, right? They're just getting initiated.
Kids who were born in 2000, yeah.
Yeah. And so, in order to...
Oh, 2020,
quote unquote,
go ahead.
Right. To qualify for what we consider G&T, you have to be 2 standard grade levels ahead of something in some content area, right? Your ELA may be on grade level, but your math may be 2 years advanced, or vice versa, or some other determination. And to try and evaluate that for a 4 and 5-year-old, it's just, as we all know, zip codes shouldn't determine the quality of education you're getting. You alluded to that a little bit about whether or not in the home environment you were introduced into ELA, into math, right? You can see the compounding effect happen as you get to 3rd grade, and that's where maybe resources really should be dumped in. But again, I think that we should be thinking about gifted and talented students as having perhaps an individualized education plan, because all students deserve specialized education, and maybe sorry. Oh, no,
I was just going to say I need to move on to some other calls, but I really appreciate those points from a recovering teacher's perspective, as you described yourself. And we're going to go next to Leslie in Brooklyn. You're on WNYC. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for taking my call. I really think I have a little bit of a unique perspective because I am a longtime mom in New York City public schools. I have 2 daughters, and they are 11 years apart. So my first daughter was in New York City public school in the Talented and Gifted program in the 90s. And then my younger daughter, when she came up of age to go to school, we thought about putting her in the Talented and Gifted program, or going through the process and seeing if she qualified. And I'll tell you, I have such a distinct personal experience with this because my older daughter, who was in the TEG program in the 90s, the way they used to build those community of learners was you would take your child to an assimilated classroom situation on a given day. This was the testing, but it wasn't a standardized test score they were looking for. And they would be in an assimilated classroom situation with like 4 or 5 other students. There is a designated number of teachers there observing the student, and they looked for qualities of these children. It's not about knowledge. Einstein said imagination is way more important than knowledge. And you can evaluate a 4 or 5-year-old by social maturity. And that has to do with how curious they are with each other. How do they interact with each other? Are they able to sort of get along together? There's a certain level of maturity they would look for. They would look for things like task commitment. Could a child sit down and stick with a task for 3 or 4 minutes, which at that age was a really big deal if a child could do that. Some children can't, and that's okay. They have other things that they're going on to explore, but those specific qualities was how they built the community of learners in the TAG program in the 90s, and it was amazing. And it didn't statistically, I'm sure, compared with the general population. However, it was economically diverse. Like my children's class was made up of kids from every aspect of the economic spectrum of New York City. By the time my younger daughter came up, it was all based on a standardized test score. So you can imagine the kids that have been getting into the tag programs the last 15 years in New York City are parents who can afford to have their children tutored for those tests. And I opted to just not even participate because I knew that was so far from what my first daughter's experience had been, which was amazing, to, you know, the standardized test score, which you know, already mentioned earlier in the program was already, you know, taken over in the curriculum. Well, it took over the tag program. And
so interesting, Leslie. It sounds like you're a one family natural controlled experiment. So I really appreciate you sharing that story. But Alex Zimmerman from Chalkbeat, from what I've read, it's not just a standardized test now for kindergarten. It's kindergarten teachers somehow nominating kids with parent input. What is the actual screen for kindergarten, quote, gifted and talented?
Yeah, so when you apply for elementary schools for kindergarten, you rank your options, and if you have selected gifted programs, then it is up to your pre-K teacher to decide whether to nominate you, like whether to sign off on that. And if they do, then you are then eligible for a lottery. So if there are more students who have applied and who have been nominated than seats, then it's just a straight lottery. And that replaced a system that existed before the pandemic where there was an exam, like there was just one test that 4-year-olds would
So
kind of opt
if
into.
Leslie had a third child a few years later than her second child, she would have encountered even a third system, the one you're describing as the present one.
Right. And one thing I wanted to go back to that both callers alluded to is this kind of notion of inclusion and to what extent like tracking is appropriate for students this young. And when former Mayor Bill de Blasio proposed phasing out gifted programs at elementary schools, one thing the city was talking a lot about were these school-wide enrichment models, where instead of tracking students out into different classrooms, you would maybe have like 1 or 2 periods a day of accelerated work for some kids, or you could have small groups, or you could have, like, if you have older kids and you have students who are into like a specific subject or are strong in photography or something, like you could have electives, like this sort of approach where you're not fully funneling students into separate classrooms. And it's been interesting because, Mamdani has said that he wants to phase out these kindergarten tracks into gifted and talented, but we haven't heard a lot from him yet about like whether he imagines some kind of enrichment model replacing that. And so it'll be interesting to see how that develops. And, obviously we're hearing a debate right now between him and Cuomo and Sliwa about, whether these programs should be phased out at the kindergarten level or expanded. And those are obviously really different competing visions.
So one more thing before we go. On the specialized high schools, Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and the handful of others, there are so few Black and Latino kids this year in Stuyvesant and Bronx Science. That was a news story. I'm not sure about the others, but so few that it calls into question whether the admissions test called the SHSAT, what it's really measuring, and whether the test should be the sole criteria for admission to those schools, which it is. And this is a debate that's been going on for years. Many of our listeners know Mamdani went to Bronx Science, and I've seen it reported that he used to be for scrapping the test, but is no longer for that. It's not on his website either way. What can you tell us about the Mamdani position, and if it's any different from the Cuomo or Sliwa position?
Yeah, it's been kind of an interesting evolution for him. In 2022, he answered a questionnaire and said that he favors getting rid of the sole admissions test, the specialized high school admissions test. And then during the campaign, he kind of staked out a slightly different position, which is that he wanted to do a study of the test to see if it was, racially biased or had gender bias, and has now since said that he supports keeping the test. So he is seemingly closed the door.
As the sole criteria?
Yeah. At least that's my interpretation of what he's signaling. I don't think, yeah.
you're an education reporter, not a political reporter, but do you have reason to believe that this is to some degree because the base of his support in the primary included a lot of votes from East Asian and South Asian parents who are well represented in the specialized high schools whose kids, perform well on those tests, and he didn't want to challenge his potential base part of it on something that they're very interested in? Or is that too cynical?
No, I think that could definitely be part of it. I don't think his base of voters has one view of this. And, I think we saw under Mayor Bill de Blasio when he proposed getting rid of the exam and trying to go to Albany to get the change in state law you would need to make that happen, that there was like an enormous amount of pushback and controversy. And I don't know, it's kind of interesting because Mamdani has talked about wanting to foster school integration without going into a lot of specifics about that. And so it's interesting that on the one hand, he's saying, like, I don't want this kind of assessment at the kindergarten level to track students, but I'm comfortable with it at the high school level for these 8 schools. It would be really interesting to hear from him about, like, how he reconciles those positions.
All right. Well, maybe in the debates coming up later this month, one of which I'll be a questioner in on October 22nd. And that ends our 30 Issues in 30 Days election series for today, Day 12, Issue 12, how Mamdani, Cuomo, and Sliwa would try to improve the public schools, at least several of the debates within that vast topic. We thank Alex Zimmerman from the Education News website, Chalkbeat. Alex, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. This year's Nobel Peace Prize was announced this morning, and it goes to María Corina Machado, the Venezuelan opposition leader who has spent years challenging Nicolas Maduro's authoritarian rule, often at personal cost. She's been banned from running for office, accused of treason, and forced to campaign underground. The Nobel Committee is recognizing her for, quote, her tireless work promoting democratic rights for the people of Venezuela and for her struggle to achieve a just and peaceful transition from dictatorship to democracy. Here is part of the official announcement.
Ms. Machado has been a key unifying figure in a political opposition that was once deeply divided, an opposition that found common ground in the demand for free election and representative government. This is precisely what lies at the heart of democracy, our shared willingness to defend the principles of popular rule, even though we disagree. At a time when democracy is under threat, it is more important than ever to defend this common ground.
That was the chair of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, Horhen Watney Fridnes. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that name this morning. And here's the winner, María Corina Machado. In her own words, this is from a short phone interview with the Nobel Institute just after the announcement.
I accept this as a recognition to our people, to the millions of Venezuelans that are, anonymous, and that they're risking everything they have for freedom, justice, and peace. And I'm sure that, absolutely convinced that we will achieve it.
So what does it mean for the committee to choose her at this moment? And from that country, Venezuela, which, separate from what she's being recognized, has this complicated relationship with the United States right now, right? Such a flood of asylum seekers from Venezuela in recent years, the Trump crackdown on them, singling out Venezuelan gangs as, somehow representing the immigrants from Venezuela, and also the recent attack by the U.S. military on 2 alleged drug boats from there. So what message is the committee sending the world by elevating this cause at this moment? We will also talk about the Middle East peace process now with our guest, Gideon Rose, adjunct senior professor at the Council on Foreign, adjunct senior fellow, at the Council on Foreign Relations, former editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, and the author, certainly relevant to the Middle East situation at this moment, of the book How Wars End. We'll ask him if what's going on now fits into any pattern of how wars end that he documented in his book. Gideon, always good to have you on the show. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks, Brian. Always great to be here.
And listeners, we're going to open up the phones first for anyone, just in case anyone is listening who has ties to Venezuela and maybe knows the work of Maria Corina Machado or wants to say anything about this particular Nobel Peace Prize award at this particular moment. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. For now, if you have ties to Venezuela, then we'll open it up more broadly later. Call or text 212-433-9692. So, Gideon, there was a little thumbnail in the intro, but tell us more. Who is Maria Corina Machado?
So she's an inspirational figure who is the Venezuelan opposition leader and trying to stand for the principles of democracy and liberalism in a very difficult political situation in her country. And I think it's a solid choice. The Nobel Peace Prize tends to fall into one of three categories. There are ideological prizes that essentially represent the hobby horses of the committee and are not really a serious intellectual or practical effort. There are inspirational prizes in which they're giving prizes to causes that deserve a public boost and things that are related to peace, and it's in effect an inspiration to all who want to keep the struggle going. And then there are practical prizes that are given for actual accomplishments, often sort of not particularly, somewhat cynical, practical compromises, the real world of peacemaking. And it's interesting because let's say, for example, that the Gaza Prize comes next year. Let's say that the ceasefire in Gaza holds and emerges into something somewhat durable, maybe even the start of some peace process. And next year, Trump and Netanyahu and the Qataris and somebody from Gaza gets the prize. That would represent a sequence from last year's prize, which was essentially ideological to the bomb survivors, this year's prize, which is essentially inspirational, to next year's prize, which could be essentially practical. So that's the way to think about this. There are multiple categories of the prizes, and this year's prize is to a good person doing good things, struggling for a good cause that they wanted to recognize and give a public boost to.
It is interesting to spotlight Venezuela right at this moment because of the relationship with the U.S., or maybe only people in the U.S. would think about it this way, or people paying attention to the news in the U.S. would think about it this way. But I said it in the intro, we've had the flood of asylum seekers from Venezuela the last few years. We've had the Trump administration's focus on Venezuelan gang members as a reason for the mass deportation program now underway. And now the U.S. launching military attacks that have killed people on alleged drug boats, not the way the U.S. has tried to apprehend and arrest people on drug boats in the past, widely considered a violation of both U.S. and international law. But all of that is going on at the same time. Does this have something to do with that or nothing to do with any of that?
No, it's an interesting question. We don't know about the specific politics of it, but by highlighting neither the immigration, not the crime, and not the drug boat interdictions and the potential state of war there, but rather the relatively uncontroversial and sensible quest for political democracy and freedom inside Venezuela, I think the committee has done an unusually sensible job in focusing attention where it deserves to be, rather than on either highly ideological or personal or somewhat inappropriate, controversial sides of things. And so I think that this is actually a way of reframing the discussion and saying that what's really most important about what's going on in Venezuela is not the gang stuff and it's not the drug stuff, but it's actually the basic fight for political rights and freedom, which Machado represents.
It does make the point, though, doesn't it, which sort of supports the political left and sort of supports the political right, that on the one hand, Maduro is a really bad guy. And so if we take that as a premise, of course, the conservatives in the United States are the more outspoken, I think it's fair to say, against Maduro as a leftist authoritarian leader of Venezuela. But it also makes the case for the more liberal people with respect to borders to say, yeah, that flood of asylum seekers that was coming more from Venezuela than anywhere else during the Biden administration had a reason to be escaping.
Yes. Well, one of the most interesting, another time we can discuss essentially migration in Latin America, which has multiple causes and has also been stopped more than many thought by the Trump administration, thought it would be by the Trump administration's policies. But it's not, the relation of migration to peace is kind of tricky. You can make arguments, but certainly if you had a stable, legitimate, economically successful government in a country, there would be much less migration from it. And so if Machado could actually take power, if Venezuela could actually manage its affairs better, then a whole bunch of positive goals would be served, including the stopping or the lessening of some of the migration issues, including crime, including peace.
It also seems to me that the Nobel Peace Prize goes to basically two different categories of people. Tell me if you agree or disagree with this. People who actually are involved in negotiating peace. You could think of many examples over the years, people, in a conflict situation who negotiated peace, either as a participant or as a mediator, or people who are activists for human rights, as in this case. Not necessarily a peacemaker per se, in a war situation, but somebody who's advocating for human rights, including this year's winner. Would you say those are two basic categories of who gets the Nobel Peace Prize, and the second one doesn't necessarily address peace per se?
I agree, but I think there's also a division in the second category between people who are activists in causes related to practical, political, and peace and security issues, and people who are not really. So that last year's prize, which was given to the survivors of the atomic bombings, and it was an attempt to raise the profile of the anti-nuclear movement in some respects, and presumably to warn against the potential future use of nuclear weapons, it was utterly disconnected from reality. The threat for nuclear weapons was being raised by a Russian aggressor, and the bombs were used in an attempt to defeat an aggressor. So there was no structural parallel. And besides, to the extent that nuclear weapons have affected peace rather than rights, they've probably helped provide for stable peace during the Cold War and the long peace rather than undermined it. So you could have made a case, however controversial, that the bomb deserved the prize last year more than the victims of the bomb. But this year's prize, Machado, is actually an activist. And you can make a cause, not just an activist, an outside civil society activist, but a political actor in her country's politics, trying to bring about a democratic system, which we know does relate to peace, is related to a positive set of political outcomes. So you can make the case that this is not just an inspirational or aspirational prize, but one that is connected solidly by both theory and practice to some outcome that is plausibly related to the prize itself.
And I'm going to ask you more about Machado herself and her background, but I want to acknowledge that we're getting either texts or calls from, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different phone numbers with people saying versions of the same thing. And I think you could guess what it is. I'll read one that doesn't include a curse word. It says, it's a direct slap on the face to Trump. Your reaction?
Well, I mean, you could see it as a slap in the face to Trump for two reasons. Either because not giving it to him for Gaza when he was obviously lobbying for it is a downside. But it could also be because of some relation to what he's doing in Venezuela. I don't think this is a direct slap in the face to Trump. In one sense, because the official rules of the game say you shouldn't be nominated for stuff this year. It's the previous year. And the Gaza stuff, it's just way too early. If the Gaza stuff had happened in the spring and you had actually a real process that built on that, there could be a legitimate case for giving Trump the prize. If the Gaza settlement actually starts a process that is built on, you could make a solid case for next year. If what Trump has done in Gaza, belatedly applying pressure to both sides, is carried out with regard to Ukraine, in which pressure on Russia is combined with pressure on Ukraine to lead to some sort of ceasefire or settlement there. You could make an even better case that that would be a legitimate peace prize next year. So I don't think this is a slap in the face at Trump. It's sort of a not yet. And in fact, by holding out the possibility of giving a prize in the future for developments if they continue and solidify, that's a legitimate incentive structure going forward.
I know you're going to want to hear some of these listeners. So another text says it's a big middle finger to Trump. Another one uses these initials and says it's a big F-U to Trump. Another one says, I guess Trump didn't present sufficient evidence to the UN General Assembly that global warming is a hoax. You get where a bunch of our callers are going. But Gideon, about Machado. She comes from a prominent Venezuelan family, I see. Her father was an industrialist and founder of a large steel company. She studied industrial engineering at a university in Venezuela and later at Yale. She co-founded an election monitoring group, served briefly in the Venezuelan National Assembly, and has long been one of the most recognizable figures to Venezuelans in the opposition. So how do those parts of her bio help explain her prominence and how she's perceived by supporters and, for that matter, by critics?
Well, this is, I think, an absolutely legitimate prize because this is somebody who has chosen to put her privilege and her principles together to work at the slow boring of hard boards, as Weber talked about, for political change in her country in a positive direction. And this is something that the committee, in a rare bit of sense, one might say, has decided to recognize because this is how political change happens. It happens, positive, constructive political change happens when political entrepreneurs enter into activism in a structural context that might actually make it work. If you're just fighting an impossible structure, it's never going to work. But history doesn't happen just by inevitable forces. There's no invisible hand that forces possible good things to emerge. It happens through individual efforts of people like Machado. And so somebody who has done, in effect, all the right things, checked off the right boxes, kept her principles while being pragmatic and effective and trying to generate change, this is what the prize can and should be done. And frankly, it would be an appropriate prize next year if the Gaza deal holds up and becomes the foundation for something better and a restarting of the peace process. It would be appropriate to give it even to people involved like Netanyahu and Trump and people from Hamas if they have dirty hands that have had bad things happen. I was talking to somebody the other day who said it was a shame that Arafat got the prize. It discredited the prize to give it to a terrorist. Well, he got the prize along with Clinton and Rabin for the start of the Oslo process. And that was a legitimate movement towards peace. It didn't ultimately work. And perhaps, there should be a mechanism for revoking a prize later. But giving in the real world, peace happens not just through activism and not just through the Keebler elves and positive astrology and the stars aligning, but through practical people making choices that lead to a better outcome. And this is a legitimate start from that because people like Machado do it. And what's happening in the Middle East is how things look when things actually move forward. It's never perfect. It's never great. The people involved are never true saints because saints don't actually appear much in practical politics. But it's a step forward to make the world better, and that's what the prize should be about.
We do have a call who wants to push back on this as a good person to give the Nobel Peace Prize to, and I think on the legitimacy of the Nobel Committee and their process generally, not because of the history of awarding it to Arafat in that case, but from a different political perspective. Dominic in the Bronx, you're on WNYC with Gideon Rose from the Council on Foreign Relations. Hi, Dominic.
Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Mr. Gideon Rose. I think the Nobel Peace Prize lost its legitimacy when it awarded it to Henry Kissinger. And in that way, there's an irony because in a way, Trump is ideal because he's, maybe fomented a little bit of peace in the Middle East, and he's starting war with his own people in the United States. So maybe he's actually a legitimate recipient of the Nobel so-called Peace Prize. And Machado is part of this right-wing cabal sponsored by the United States to overthrow a government, which the United States always does. Don't get me wrong. This is very American, like apple pie and the Yankees. So I'm in a little bit of a conundrum trying to figure out how to understand and appreciate the prize. We can give it to someone who's sponsored by United States to overthrow a democratically elected government. And if we're going to start doing that, we have got a lot of governments to overthrow. And if Trump gets it, well, it just further points out what the Nobel Peace Prize really stands for. That's my 2 cents. I don't know who to give it to. I would imagine giving it to maybe someone who's tried to work toward peace. And it's hard to figure out who that would be.
Do you think Machado has been a good head of state? Are you saying that? Not Machado.
No.
Maduro.
Brian, to be fair, I'm a libertarian socialist. I don't think there are very many good heads of state. I think the state is a dangerous concept that divides us. I know I sound like pie in the sky, and I'm going to stay in the sky. So I think Maduro's problematic. But I also think Trump's problematic. I think Putin's problematic. I think Netanyahu's problematic. So maybe we should just dispel with the nonsense of awarding basically, for the most part, people who are war criminals or potential war criminals.
Dominic, thank you for your call. And Gideon, I will say that there are a few other people chiming in related things. One points out that Machado was a guest on Donald Trump Jr.'s podcast earlier this year, and we have another text indicating that she had asked Benjamin Netanyahu to intervene in a certain way in Venezuela. It's not clear to me exactly what that was, but the listener is obviously suspicious of her because of that. So your reaction to any of those things, or confirm the facts if you know them.
Okay, so first of all, I appreciate Dominic's consistency. Given his position, I don't entirely disagree with his notion that all political leaders have some form of dirty hands, and that political power is a nasty thing. But it can also be better or worse. And so, and I also agree that this is not a great year for peace prizes, in the sense that I was trying to think who I would want to give it to myself. And it was very hard to come up this year with good candidates because there hasn't been a whole lot of work towards practical peace this year. The world is going in a bad direction rather than a good direction. Maybe things are turning around a little bit. We will see. But let
me just throw in one more here. A text that just came in. This Nobel is bizarre. Machado wasn't in favor of democracy when she worked to overthrow the democratically elected Chavez government. Chavez was corrupt, so is Trump, but nobody here is working to non-democratically overthrow our elected Trump government.
So the Political development in Latin America in the contemporary era is a very interesting and complex subject. And there are people who have been supporters of Chavez and Maduro. And they originally started out with some, perhaps, democratic legitimacy, but they've run the country into the ground. And the opposition, I think, has a stronger case. And I don't buy the grounds that Machado is some sort of right-wing tool or puppet. She seems to be somebody who sincerely wants a better political future for her country, and I think it would benefit not just her country, but the region and the world. So I think that's a legitimate thing. The question about whether it was a bad idea to give Kissinger the prize is an interesting question, because that's the same thing as the Arafat thing in reverse. Kissinger got the prize for helping to broker a deal to end the Vietnam War. Now, many people felt that was an inappropriate thing. Tom Lehrer said, I'm going to give up comedy because there's no room for comedy in a world in which Henry Kissinger gets the Peace Prize. That's I can't compete with that.
By the way, no relation, Tom Lehrer, except extreme admiration from this radio host. Go ahead.
No, I agree. But the look, again, if you're giving things to people who are nice because you want to, like Dominic, you want to believe that the world can be better than the one we have, and you're going to give it to, in effect, practical saints. You want to give it to Paul Farmer or Jane Goodall or people who are true secular saints. But then there are practical people who actually make individual situations better. And if we get a deal in Gaza that actually stops the killing and moves towards a peace process, or we get a deal in Ukraine that stops the killing and moves towards security in the region, and if we get a deal in Venezuela that actually moves towards popular government that isn't oppressive, that isn't violating the rights of people and destabilizing the region, that would be a good thing. So I don't have as many expectations of the millennium coming soon. So I think there's a role for giving the prize to people who are trying to bring about practical change in a positive way. And I think that's useful and valuable.
Let's take a phone call from Jesus, who says he's a Venezuelan New Yorker. Jesus, thank you for calling in. Hello.
Hi, Brian. My name is Jesus. I'm from Venezuela. I've been in New York most of my life, and I just was listening to somebody just a few minutes ago saying that.
Whoops! Did we lose Jesus's line? Jesus, it looks like we still have you. Try it again. All right. Let's see. Gideon, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Let me actually just say one more thing about Machado while you're getting the phones on. Being realistic, I don't think this prize will change much about what happens in Venezuela. But I think it will protect Machado's life. By making her a Nobel laureate, this raises her visibility and it increases the costs and of attempts to suppress and destroy her. And so by, in effect, putting the sanction of international benevolent opinion on her efforts, it may protect her life. And that's a good thing that deserves to have been done, even if it doesn't actually produce a lot of change in Venezuela in the near or even midterm.
Yeah, and something you just referred to is something I think is important for our listeners who don't know Machado to know, which is that reportedly she has been in hiding since the government cracked down on her opposition campaign earlier this year. So you're saying it may not bring change, this Nobel Peace Prize, structurally in Venezuela, but it may at least save her life. That's an actual risk.
Exactly. And I think that's actually a positive thing, because it basically says there are going to be costs for suppressing democracy movements, and you're going to suffer international public opprobrium if you kill a good guy, or in this case, a good woman, trying to make the world better and trying to make your country better. And that's a legitimate sort of minor benefit of the prize.
Well, do you think that her getting the prize might wind up legitimizing or giving Trump a talking point for legitimizing U.S. military intervention with these Venezuelan boats, or even to remove Maduro? The New York Times recently noted some Venezuelans' belief that any action might be justified to defend last year's disputed election, which Maduro apparently lost, but he's still in office, and that she, Machado, has voiced support for possible U.S. military intervention to remove Maduro. Is that your understanding?
So I don't think the Trump administration is eager to get involved in any kind of regime change in Venezuela or trying hard to actually militarily intervene. What they're doing on the drug stuff and in terms of the boats and the crime, it's somewhat performative. It's somewhat violent. It's not the prelude to a giant major new war in the region. And I think they don't like getting involved in that. So I don't think this is actually, and they don't need the Nobel Committee's backing to come up with a rationale. This administration does whatever it wants to do for its own reasons.
I think we have Jesus back now. Let's see if his line is connected any better this time. Jesus, you're on WNYC again. You there?
Hi, Brian. Hi. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened.
It's all right. Give it another shot.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I was listening to this person saying that Maria Corina is a right-wing puppet, which is absolutely not true. People don't understand what's happening in Venezuela. Venezuela is being, kidnapped by this regime, the Maduro regime. And what she did, like nobody else have done in the world, is that she proved that the elections back in July 2024 were rigged by showing copies of the voting ballots. And because it's automatic with the machines, the copies of it, she was able to collect it and show it. And she proved that they won, and that the person that won is the person that runs supported by her by 70% of the vote. And, she's the only opposition leader that remains in Venezuela, and that requires courage. Also, it's confusing what's happening with this quote-unquote support from Donald Trump to Venezuela. I believe the whole bombarding boats in the coast of Venezuela, it is definitely performative. We don't know what the end game is, and when I look at the news this morning, I am concerned how Donald Trump is reacting that Maria Corina Machado wants the Nobel Peace Prize when that's something that he wanted so badly. So we're going to see now if this quote-unquote support that the Donald Trump administration is giving to Venezuela is actually going to continue.
Jesus, I'm going to leave it there for time. Great point.
That's actually a good point. Let me build on that, Brian. That's actually a good point, because you could think of this in two ways. You could think, or three ways about the relation of the prize to Trump. One is what your first caller said, which is, oh my God, this might actually lead Trump to get more involved, to upstage this by finally doing a strike on land or even invading. I don't think that's plausible given the Trump administration. You can do or it could happen what your caller just said, Jesus just said, which is this could make Trump annoyed and less interested in helping out the opposition because he didn't win and he's resentful of her prominence. But I think either of those outcomes is less likely, and I think it's more just not really related to Trump. This is actually orthogonal to a Trump-related prize. It's neither a giant middle finger nor is it sucking up to him. It's in effect, it's buying time to see what the Trump administration will actually do in its supposed peacemaking efforts and the big game issues, which right now are both Gaza and Ukraine.
And as we segue after a break to talking about Trump and the Gaza peace process, Gaza and Israel peace process, I'll just read two headlines as kind of a footnote to the last caller and what you were just saying. One, there are a lot of headlines like this. Here's USA Today. It says, White House complains about Trump's perceived Nobel Peace Prize snub. And another one, Times of Israel, says Netanyahu posts AI image of Trump winning the Nobel Peace Prize. So we will continue in a minute with Gideon Rose from the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the book, How Wars End, among other books, and talk about whether this war is ending between Israel and Hamas. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. A few more minutes with Gideon Rose from the Council on Foreign Relations, former editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. And Gideon, you wrote the book, How Wars End. Is this war really ending, apparently, in Gaza? And does it fit into any historical pattern that you documented in your book, at least to the extent that these negotiations have gotten so far?
Okay, so big questions. The short answer is maybe, but we will see how this play out. We should remember that we had a ceasefire at the beginning of the year, which Netanyahu ultimately violated and the Israelis violated. We now are back to one after a lot more killing, but also a lot more destruction of Israel's foes in various places. So this one might stick. From a Clausewitzian perspective, from an international relations perspective, wars involve the use of violence for political ends by states. And they end when those ends are achieved and you've beaten your enemy, or both sides or all sides realize they can't actually get what they want from fighting. And so they choose to stop fighting and do something else, talk, and so forth. And what you're seeing in Gaza, and what you also might become to be seeing next year or so, perhaps in Ukraine, is the exhaustion of the belligerents, realizing that there is no significant major purpose to be accomplished by further fighting because they're not going to get much, which creates a space, an opening, a possibility for the kinds of negotiations and political entrepreneurship inside and outside that would create a settlement that could lead to peace. First a ceasefire, then to some sort of peace and then some sort of settlement. I don't think what's happening in the Middle East, in Gaza right now, is peace. And there are a lot of big questions, from the control of Gaza to the status of Hamas to the ultimate fate of the two-state solution, that are all still up in the air and need to be negotiated. But having the killing stop and having people talk is a better move. As Churchill famously once said, jaw is better than war. And the fact that the parties have agreed to stop the immediate killing, if it can be maintained and nurtured, and it can be and the parties who are responsible for this, which is not just Israel and Hamas, but the U.S. putting pressure on both sides, the Europeans and the Arabs coming together, and the Gulf states, who are in many respects one of the big winners of this, showing their role as mediators and key players in the situation. This is definitely a positive sign, but hold the champagne. Yeah. It's a lot of hard work to come. But if it could be built on, then it would be a legitimate case for a peace prize next year.
I don't know if you can answer this in our remaining 30 seconds, but to the model you just laid out of stopping the fighting when one side or both are exhausted, why wouldn't Hamas have reached that point earlier? We have 60,000 plus Palestinians dead there, and they presumably knew for a long time they couldn't win the war. They were overmatched by the Israeli military. 20 seconds. Why didn't they reach that point earlier?
Because they are very ideologically committed to very big goals. And the people who were bearing the brunt were often innocent Gazans and Palestinians. And in effect, there was a cynical ploy to hope that the more Israel did to hurt Palestinians, the more other people would pressure the Israelis to stop.
And that is it with Gideon Rose, Council on Foreign Relations, author of books, including How Wars End. Thank you for talking about this and the Nobel Peace Prize with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and we're going to end today's show with a preview of a new documentary coming to PBS next week. Have you heard of the Rails to Trails movement? Perhaps you know or participate in the conservancy with the same name dedicated to turning abandoned railroad tracks into walking and biking paths for the general public. It comes from a 60-year-old grassroots movement that saw the opportunity to make nature accessible as railroad lines were abandoned across the country. That was as commuting became more by car. Next Wednesday, October 15th, PBS is bringing that movement to television with the premiere of the documentary From Rails to Trails. Here's the 30-second trailer narrated by Edward Norton.
It's one of America's most unlikely movements. The fight to convert abandoned railroads to trails.
There's no way of getting something as terrific as a trail without putting some work into it.
A movement that met roadblocks at every turn.
That is prime real estate.
I'm Edward Norton, and this is the story of a national transformation from rails to trails.
So joining me now to discuss not just the documentary, but the movement, because he's sort of the man, is Peter Harnick, co-founder of the Rails to Trails Conservancy and the Center for City Park Excellence at the Trust for Public Land, and executive producer of the documentary From Rails to Trails. Peter, thanks for coming on. Congratulations on this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
And this is one of those segments where I have to do full disclosure, because I am a big Rails to Trails fan. My wife and I tend to build our summer vacations around rail trails for biking. In the last 2 years, we've gone to places along the Empire State Trail and the Harlem Valley Rail Trail, also the two paths along the Delaware, on both the New Jersey and Pennsylvania side, what they call the towpath, in the Lambertville, New Hope area. We've been to the wonderful Lake Champlain Causeway Bike Trail, which I know is in the film, and more, and we donate to the Rails to Trails Conservancy. So full disclosure. And
that's wonderful. I had a mental picture of you just stuck in your studio 24 hours a day, not getting out.
23, yeah. You've biked over 200 trails across the country, I see.
That's right, 207. Not that I'm counting.
And let me actually open the phones here for our limited time and invite people to shout out any favorite rail to trail that you have ridden on a bike or walked as a pedestrian or walked your dog on or whatever. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. How'd the movement get started?
Well, the railroads, back in the day when the railroads were the most powerful industry in the country and were dominating everything, they built 254,000 miles of track, which is much, much larger than the interstate highway system is today. And as the economics, it was overbuilt. And as the economics changed, they had to start abandoning some of them, and many of them got lost. But starting in the 1960s, people started realizing, wait a second, these are fabulous corridors to just walk on and bike on and enjoy nature and everything else, and let's try and save them. And it isn't as easy as you think, which is what the film is about. But over 2,000 of them have been saved now, from short segments to several hundred miles long, and it's become a cornerstone of the new America.
You do attribute the birth of the Rails to Trails movement to an individual named May Watts. Who's she?
May Watts was with the Arboretum in the Morton Arboretum in Chicago. And she would go to England and walk. England has a wonderful system of just allowing people to walk through the backlands of all these properties without any restrictions. And she came back and said, A, we have to do that here too, because it's a wonderful thing. And B, especially in the Midwest, where we used to have millions and millions of acres of prairie that have all been plowed under, there's hardly any prairie left. And the little bit of prairie that was left was alongside these railroad corridors because they had never been plowed. So she started the movement. I love this story because she actually wrote a letter to the editor of the Chicago Tribune. And people say, what good would a letter to the editor do? But it actually started the movement back in 1963.
We heard a clip in the trailer of one of the opponents to a particular rail trail somewhere saying, this is prime real estate. So how much opposition has this movement faced? Because it sounds like, mom and apple pie sweetness when you describe it the way you do, but land use is always controversial in so many places. So what have the main sources of pushback been?
Well, yeah, as you say, land is very controversial. The railroads acquired the land in numerous different legalistic ways way back when, and especially in agricultural territory and in farm country, there's often lore in the family. Well, our great-great-grandfather, the railroad stole the land from our great-grandfather, and they said if they ever stop running, we'll get it back again. And in some cases that's true, and in other cases they got the land in different ways. It's a legal morass, and many of these rail trail projects end up in court to try and straighten out who owns what and who paid for what and who needs to get repaid for what. Congress and for a while it looked like every time there was an abandonment, which is a legal procedure, an abandonment. Then the quarters got all split up, and it was really impossible to put them back together like Humpty Dumpty. But then Congress passed a law saying that if a railroad abandons a track and a local community thinks that it might be reusable for railroad purposes in the future, which might be mass transit or any other kinds of railroad uses, we can use it as a trail in the interim. So that's called rail banking. It's putting the railroad corridor into a bank for the future and using it as a trail. So quite a few trails that you've been on and some others are banked. Others have been purchased outright and are owned by the city, the county, the state. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of different ownership, but there is conflict.
Let me get a few callers on with their favorite rail trails. And one or two are calling and texting to oppose some ones in our area that are either proposed or that are up, and they don't like that they're there. Michael in Park Slope has a favorite. Hi, Michael.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for putting this program on. My favorite is the Elroy to Sparta bike trail in the state of Wisconsin.
Beautiful. That's featured in the movie.
Terrain. And it has some interesting tunnels.
That's right.
Tunnels, like through the mountains and forests and tunnels. Bill in Manhattan has another one. Hi, Bill.
Hi. For years, we've been, my wife and I have gone up to the Cape, and we started there about 2008. And the thing that attracted us most was the rail trail, the Cape Cod Rail Trail. And so my wife loves it so much that last summer she injured herself, couldn't ride a regular bike, and we actually purchased a recumbent trike, had it shipped to the Cape and put together by a local bike shop. And so she was able last summer to enjoy her favorite thing around the bike.
All right, here is one dissenter, at least in certain circumstances. Mark in West Orange, you're on WNYC. Hi, Mark.
Hello there. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. However, there is a proposal that has been approved to have an old railway from Montclair to Hoboken, where it should have been saved for light rail, for commuting purposes, and public transportation. That was a waste of an opportunity, in my opinion, because it can never be claimed back.
And another, I'm just going to jump in for time. Another listener writes, rails to trails is great, except in denser urban areas where right-of-way is near priceless for reusing as mass transport. 30-second answer on this, Peter?
Well, practically all of us love railroads. We're all big fans of railroads, and we're not calling for the disassembly of any railroads anywhere. We say if the economics doesn't work out for a railroad use, then let's use it as a trail. If the economics works out for reestablishing it as a railroad, we're all in favor of that. Plus, with rail banking, you can put the railroad back in, and then there's this new thing called rails with trails, where in some cases you can put a trail alongside a railroad and get a double benefit out of it.
And by the way, I will just mention so people know that this is part of the movement. Though we've been talking mostly about rail trails out in the country, the High Line is a rail trail, right? That was a railroad bed up there. And that's
Definitely.
where we leave it with Peter Harnick, co-founder of the Rails to Trails Conservancy and the Center for City Park Excellence at the Trust for Public Land, now executive producer of From Rails to Trails, premieres on PBS next Wednesday. Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.